You could say that when a president stands before the world and promises to strike 90 trade deals in 90 days, there is a theatrical bravado that almost sounds admirable, like someone stepping onto the stage determined to bend reality to his will. And yet, as these days crawl past one by one, we are seeing in slow motion what happens when a promise becomes a trap of its own making. Donald Trump, who once bragged that no president in American history was more skilled at making deals, has now found himself cornered by the very expectations he created. He is unhappy with the response he has received so far from nearly every nation on the planet. After slapping tariffs on allies and adversaries alike, after warning that any country failing to ink a deal would face economic pain, he has discovered that intimidation is not the same thing as influence. More than 200 nations have still not signed any real trade agreement with the United States. And every day that passes, the gap between Trump's boasts and the world's reality becomes harder to disguise. If you listen carefully to the way he talks about these deals now, the confidence has started to fray around the edges. When asked which countries are close to agreements with his administration, the answer becomes a fog of generalities. "We've made a deal with China," he insists, though the Chinese president himself has never once publicly confirmed it. "We've made deals with 4 or 5 other countries, maybe the UK. Each claim sounds more like a placeholder than a fact." And every time reporters dig for evidence, they find not signed treaties or final frameworks, but vague press releases and draft memoranda. What is striking is the lack of conviction in Trump's own voice, the halting way he describes supposed triumphs that only exist in the headlines he and his team write themselves. Even some of his closest allies now quietly admit that the tariff plan he promised would rebuild America's leverage has largely fallen apart. It was nearly 2 weeks after Trump declared victory over China with an alleged trade breakthrough that the world noticed something strange. No statement had come from President Xi Jinping, no confirmation of any final document, no evidence of a genuine concession. This silence, some analysts believe, was no accident. By letting Trump announce a deal unilaterally, China could simply refuse to endorse the claim, thereby undermining his credibility without having to say a word. For Beijing, it was a subtle but effective way to remind the world that bluster is not the same thing as power. And while Trump's team repeated the story to US, news outlets, businesses on both sides of the Pacific remained in limbo, wondering whether tariffs would stay or go, whether supply chains should be moved or preserved, whether any of the threats would be real this time. The confusion has become the defining feature of the Trump trade policy. Headlines crafted for domestic consumption, followed by long periods of silence, and then a sudden reversal or escalation that nobody saw coming. When Donald Trump first began his campaign of aggressive tariffs, he described it as a necessary shock to the system. He told voters that decades of bad deals had drained American strength, that foreign governments had laughed at US negotiators while stealing jobs and technology. It was a narrative designed to make every confrontation look righteous, and to his most ardent supporters, it felt like a long overdue reckoning. But the deeper truth was simpler and less flattering. Trade agreements are not poker games where you bluff your way to victory. They are complex, painstaking processes built on trust, credibility, and compromise. The idea that a single administration could tear up decades of agreements and rebuild the entire system in a matter of weeks was never realistic. And yet, that was precisely what Trump promised. 90 trade deals in 90 days, a feat that would have required rewriting the global economy at a speed no one had ever seen. As the artificial deadline neared, reality came crashing in. Instead of delivering an avalanche of final agreements, Trump's team had assembled a patchwork of preliminary discussions and memoranda, none of them legally binding, none of them detailed enough to change the fundamentals of trade. Even Mark Short, the former White House Legislative Affairs Director, admitted that at best, the administration had general frameworks with only 2 countries out of the roughly 200 nations in the world. These are the same frameworks that Trump's trade advisor Peter Navarro had sworn would soon blossom into fully realized treaties. But with the self-imposed deadline just days away, it was clear that no such transformation was coming. In public, Trump continued to insist that victories were around the corner. In private, his team began preparing excuses. And so, to understand how this has unfolded, you have to look back at the initial gamble. Trump believed that by applying maximum pressure, slapping tariffs on steel, aluminum, cars, electronics, he could force other nations to the table. He imagined a scenario where America's economic gravity would be irresistible, where foreign leaders would rush to appease him rather than risk losing access to the US market. But instead of capitulation, he encountered caution. Allies who were once willing to negotiate in good faith grew suspicious. Rivals saw opportunity. And neutral countries simply waited to see whether Trump would follow through on his threats or lose interest. Months later, the result is not a reinvigorated trade order, but a patchwork of confusion and resentment. From farmers in Iowa to automakers in Michigan, American industries have been caught in the crossfire. Businesses that depend on predictable supply chains have watched costs rise and contracts evaporate. Investments have slowed. Prices have gone up. And yet, when Trump was confronted with these consequences, he doubled down. He declared that on July 9th, the day the 90-day promise expired, the United States would begin enforcing massive tariffs on any country that had not signed a deal. Some would face penalties as high as 50%. He even went on Fox News to boast that letters would soon be dispatched to every government around the world, instructing them on what they had to pay to do business with the United States. To Trump, it sounded like strength. To much of the world, it sounded like extortion. The letters themselves, according to sources familiar with the drafts, are astonishing in their tone. Instead of inviting collaboration, they read like ultimatums: sign an agreement or suffer punitive tariffs. There is no acknowledgement that many of these nations had never even been consulted. No recognition that the process of trade negotiation is inherently mutual. Just a series of threats packaged in official stationery. For some countries, this is not just offensive, it is dangerous. The global economy remains fragile after years of pandemic disruptions and supply chain chaos. Inflation is squeezing consumers on every continent. And now, the world's largest economy is threatening to ignite a new wave of trade wars for the sake of a domestic political narrative. Perhaps the most telling moment came when Trump himself admitted, almost in passing, that it was impossible to negotiate with everyone. "You have 200 countries," he said. "We can't do that." And yet, in the same breath, he insisted that every country would still be expected to sign something or be punished. It is a contradiction that exposes the hollow core of the entire enterprise. How do you demand agreements from nations you haven't even spoken to? How do you impose penalties for failing to comply with the demands you never formally delivered? The answer, it seems, is that you simply declare victory and dare anyone to call your bluff. For many U.S. allies, the spectacle has become too much to tolerate. Canada, Germany, South Korea, Japan, nations that have spent decades building trade ties with Washington, are quietly preparing their own countermeasures. Some are negotiating new regional pacts that exclude the United States altogether. Others are readying tariffs of their own, aimed squarely at American exports. If this escalation continues, it will be ordinary Americans who pay the price. Consumer goods will get more expensive. Export markets will shrink. Jobs will vanish. And all because one man is determined to project an image of toughness that the facts no longer support. The rush to impose these measures is not driven by any economic necessity. It is driven by Trump's obsession with maintaining the illusion that he alone can deliver prosperity. With the 2026 midterms approaching, and his economic record under increasing scrutiny, the July 9th deadline has become an artificial finish line. A line Trump is desperate to cross, even if he has to drag the country through a trade crisis to get there. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, once seen as a steady hand, has already suggested that the deadline might need to be extended. But even he admits that the final decision rests with Trump alone. And Trump has made clear that he views any delay as a personal defeat. The irony is that while the president fixates on looking strong, his actions have exposed the fundamental weakness of his approach. Other countries have learned that if they simply wait, Trump's domestic political pressures will force him to fold. They know he is sensitive to market downturns and bond yield spikes. They know he fears looking weak before Wall Street. And so they stall, confident that the bluster will eventually collapse under its own weight. In many ways, this is the most damaging revelation of all, that the United States, once seen as a predictable and formidable trade partner, now appears erratic, reactive, and insecure. You only need to look at the so-called deal with the United Kingdom to see how this plays out in practice. Trump announced it with great fanfare, declaring it the first major agreement of his new trade era. But when reporters scrutinized the text, they found it was nothing more than a temporary measure to allow current trade to continue while formal negotiations lumbered on. It contained no new benefits, no fresh market access, no reduction in tariffs. It was simply an agreement to keep talking. British officials wasted no time clarifying that this was not a final deal, and that much more work would be needed. Privately, diplomats in London expressed frustration with what they described as America's transactional hostility, an approach that treats even close allies as adversaries to be shaken down. Inside the White House, the mood is souring. Scott Bessent, once hailed as the financial savant who could shepherd Trump's trade vision into reality, now finds himself under fire. Those close to him say he never supported the 90 Deals plan. He warned that it was reckless and bound to fail. But Trump, enamored of the headlines, pressed ahead anyway. Now, with the deadline approaching and no real achievements to showcase, the blame is falling squarely on Bessent's shoulders. Some insiders whisper that he is contemplating resignation rather than waiting to be scapegoated. In public, the administration still insists everything is under control. In private, the finger-pointing has already begun. While the administration flails, the rest of the world is moving on. Europe is forging new pacts with South Korea and India, expanding digital and agricultural trade. In Asia, the RCEP agreement, representing the largest trade bloc on Earth, continues without American involvement. Canada and Mexico are holding talks with Japan and the EU, mapping a future that increasingly excludes Washington. These efforts send a clear message. America is no longer the indispensable hub of global commerce. And rather than wait for deals that may never come, other nations are simply building a new architecture that does not revolve around the United States at all. Even America's most steadfast allies have begun to distance themselves. Japan, Australia, South Korea, and Canada, countries that once could be counted on to stand with Washington, are publicly voicing concern over Trump's aggressive tactics. These aren't just polite diplomatic protests. They are reactions to real economic damage: tariffs on steel, retaliatory measures on dairy, supply chain disruptions in technology. For a time, corporate America tried to remain silent, hoping the turbulence would subside. But as the damage mounts, even major CEOs and trade associations are breaking ranks.